Psychedelics have long been a part of the human experience, and in recent years there has been growing excitement regarding the potential that these substances may have in the treatment of mental health disorders. And for me, this is a very personal topic because, for me, as a neuroscientist and from someone who has struggled with mental health, the idea that we can have these new substances that may overcome a lot of the limitations that our current pharmacological tools have is extremely exciting. And psychiatry is one of those fields that I believe has been evolving a little bit more slowly than other fields, particularly because the brain is extremely complicated to decode and understand. But there's a great need in order to have new therapies. And so when it comes to psychedelic research, as many of you may know, in the 60s to 70s, a lot of the research was basically halted. It was stopped, and there was a lot of political motivation behind this, regarding especially because the uses of psychedelics was involved with the anti-war sentiment. So unfortunately, there was some unscientific basis to stop research on these substances. Of course, there's also the other side. Psychedelics can be deeply destabilizing. And so this is why a famous phrase by Carl Jung, which is that the purpose of religion is to stop people from having a religious experience, comes in handy, because that's precisely what psychedelics tend to do, which is that they create this sort of religious experience that has the ability to shake you to your core. And so, of course, when this isn't done in a controlled way, in a therapeutic way, this can be deeply damaging. So these are the two elements which were most likely present in the decision to ban psychedelic research. And so, essentially, with the ban of the research on these substances, we lost a lot of knowledge. And in my personal opinion, this was a deeply damaging decision, because I believe that a lot of people who struggle from mental illness can be helped by substances such as psychedelics, and that banning research on whatever compound we are discussing, I believe, is never the solution. It's just, I believe that always the solution is to deeply investigate these substances and really try to understand the dosage effect and the safety profile, and find ways to make them as effective as possible while having the least side effects. And so in the last 2 decades, mainly the last decade, we have seen once again this reemergence of psychedelic research, and the Johns Hopkins Center for Consciousness and Psychedelics played a big role in this. And with this reemergence in psychedelic research, we have been getting results that are extremely interesting, particularly in terms of its efficiency in alleviating and even putting some mental disorders into remission, such as major depressive disorder. We even have some data on bipolar disorder put into remission, which is extremely surprising given how chronic bipolar disorder is thought to be. And we have also had a lot of research regarding the use of psychedelics to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. And so this is actually our topic for today, which is that recently MDMA therapy was rejected by an FDA panel. MDMA, which is methylene dioxymethamphetamine, is a substance which you normally know through the term ecstasy. And so what MDMA does is, normally experientially, it elevates your mood, it elevates your energy states. And at the level of the brain, MDMA is a inhibitor of the monoaminergic transporters, meaning that we have these transporters which clean up the amount of these things called neurotransmitters, so these molecules in the synapse, which is the gap between the two neurons. And so MDMA both inhibits the role of these transporters, meaning that you have more quantities of these monoaminergic molecules. And at the same time, it also promotes a greater release of these molecules. And so in this case, what MDMA normally targets is the release of serotonin and dopamine. And so on a simplistic level, there is some reasoning for why MDMA could work in improving someone's mood and increasing their mental health status. Because of course, if you take a drug and it makes you feel better, then I guess somehow in some way that inevitably could be argued to be something that stops the dread or the suffering that comes from experiencing mental illness. But the question here, is that an effective treatment? How long does that last? And is it actually safe? And so prior to this decision by the FDA panel to reject MDMA therapy, some clinical trials had shown that after a year or so of having 2 to 3 sessions of MDMA assisted therapy, and here I must specify that it's not just taking the MDMA, it's actually having then some form of psychotherapy which is integrated with the actual experience of taking MDMA. And so in this respect, some studies had shown that 67% of participants no longer had an illness according to the scales they used. And in relation to the control group, where only 23% of people who had received psychotherapy and the placebo drug experienced the same benefit. And so what we can see from this is that there's clearly a significant difference between the two groups, the group which was given MDMA and the group which was given the placebo pill. And so the question here is, well, if the numbers are so good, how is it possible that an FDA panel could reject this MDMA therapy? And so I'm going to go over some of the objections which were made, and I'm going to tell you whether I believe that they are substantiated or whether I believe that there's some sort of misunderstanding going on. And so before we go on to that, the firm that sent its application to the FDA, which is called Lykos, previously called MAPS, had cited 2 clinical trials in which a total of 200 people who had received this therapy, which was, like I said before, the MDMA plus therapy or the placebo plus therapy, they saw that more than 80% of those that received the MDMA plus therapy combination had significant improvements in their symptoms, and these improvements were observed 6 to 24 months after the therapy. And so, once again, the results seem pretty good. But there were some objections by the panel regarding the safety of MDMA. And so one of the arguments that regulators put forth was that they weren't sure whether MDMA would harm the liver or cardiovascular system in the long term, because the studies that were cited by Lykos did not gather evidence that would allow for these long-term estimates and predictions to be done. And so this is, of course, a reasonable concern. In order for you to approve a drug, you need to be fully aware of what side effects might arise from actually sending out that drug. Although many of you that might be hearing this are somewhat skeptical of that statement, because as we know, there are a lot of drugs which are currently legal, which have actually terrible side effect profiles. And so, of course, it's very easy to take a cynical view over this statement. But it is something that, of course, needs to be taken into consideration. I think that's something that needs to be clarified here when we are discussing the long-term effects of MDMA use, is that MDMA would never be used as a long-term therapeutic, because there are documented neurotoxic effects of MDMA, and we know that it can be addictive because, as I said before, it has a deep modulation of dopamine. And so these interactions make MDMA have a high addiction profile. And so all of these concerns and regarding the possible toxicity of MDMA have already been documented before. But of course, like many other things, it's a case of dosage. For example, one of the most common treatments for bipolar disorder is the use of lithium. And as you might know, the difference between a toxic dose of lithium and the therapeutic range for lithium is very, very close. And so this isn't surprising at all that a compound that might have therapeutic effects might also have some level of toxicity and harmful effects for other systems of the body. But it's, once again, it's a matter of dosage. And so in isolation, this statement shouldn't be enough to, unless there is, of course, a very significant effect of toxicity that is happening from just the therapeutic dose, this shouldn't be enough for just there to be a rejection. Another thing that the panel questioned Lycos was regarding the drug's addictive potential. Additionally, this is something that I find surprising because, once again, we have data that suggests that MDMA is an addictive substance, and and furthermore, there's a biological intuition because, once again, there's a deep modulation of dopaminergic systems that go hand in hand with the use of MDMA. The potential for addiction, for me, sometimes it's a red flag when I hear it as something that can impede the approval of a certain drug, because a lot of the substances which are currently legal, especially in psychopharmacology, which if you look up and you see a description of their safety profile, what you will actually find out is, if you go and actually read the studies and you just ignore what is being conventionally said about each one of those, is that most of them are actually addictive, even SSRIs. And this is something which I find borderline unethical, which is this idea that many of these drugs are being prescribed by doctors. And once again, I'm not against any type of psychotropic drug. I believe all of them have a time and place. I have taken them in the past. So, I mean, I'm clearly not against them. But the point here is that even things such as antidepressants, which for such a long time everyone and doctors keep saying this, which is that antidepressants aren't addictive. We just know that this isn't true. We have data on it already, and we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. We have a lot of testimonies from people saying how hard it is to actually stop taking an antidepressant. And of course, this depends on antidepressant to antidepressant. It depends on the half-life of the antidepressant in question. But we have so much evidence, and we have so much testimonies about, you can name it, even, for example, Ambien, which is extremely addictive. For a long time, even after it was released, it was claimed to be a safe long-term insomnia treatment pill. And so for me, it's just amazing sometimes to see how there's such a big discrepancy when it comes to looking at the safety profile of alternative treatment methods, such as in the case of psychedelic medicine. But if you just go into more of the conventional realm of drug treatments, that same demand, that same rigor in terms of understanding their safety profile isn't applied. And here, of course, it's very easy, once again, to take the cynical view that it's Big Pharma that's behind this and that these people have malevolent intentions. But honestly, in my opinion, I don't think that's the case. I just truly think that people get stuck in their own paradigms. And so, for example, with the serotonin hypothesis, in which everyone just said that, okay, the true reason for depression, the neurobiological reason for depression, is that there's a deficiency in serotonin. That's the case. If you fix that up, just give someone an antidepressant and they'll be fine. You know, just having that view that serotonin is the key, and even after having several studies and having several anecdotal evidence that antidepressants actually don't work for a great percentage of people, that still wasn't enough to promote research in perhaps trying to find other receptors, other biological targets. And so sometimes I don't think it's actually evil intention. It's more so people get stuck in these conventional, and then that just, of course, biases research into just being stuck in that, and it closes the doors on alternative forms of research. And so in the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, this is even more worrisome because conventional forms of treatment, which pharmacologically speaking, we're talking about the case of SSRIs such as fluoxetine and sertraline, we are talking about a drug modality that has deeply unsatisfying efficacy rate. So we're talking about up to 47% of people who are given these SSRIs who have post-traumatic stress disorder don't actually respond to the drug. And so this is a lot of suffering being compounded. And there's clearly a need for better solutions. On the side of therapy, because once again, we always need to discuss the conjunction of pharmacological intervention and the use of other behavioral approaches, such as therapy. And so in this case, when it comes to therapy, we have two major lines of therapy which are used. One of them is cognitive behavioral therapy, and then we also have prolonged exposure therapy, where the person needs to confront their trauma over and over until they build tolerance and build a different perception of that trauma. And so, as you might know, this is an extremely hard process. Most people quit because it's just too hard to relive a certain trauma. Because when we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, we're discussing people who went through unbelievable, painful events that led to trauma, which is a maladaptive plastic response. So this led to highly maladaptive behavioral adaptations. And so this can mean, for example, nightmares. It can be having constant flashbacks, panic attacks, avoidance. There's a lot of suffering that goes into something such as post-traumatic stress disorder. But so, going back from my rant about addiction, another argument which was used is that these types of studies which are using psychedelic substances cannot be blind. And so what this means is that in clinical research, normally we double blinding a study is very useful to reduce the expectancy effect. Because, for example, if someone knows that they're taking a particular drug, so if, for example, if they know that they're not in the placebo group, that might alter the actual results because there's an expected effect. We know that this plays a role. And so when it comes to psychedelics, it's extremely hard to have this blinding effect controlled because the sole purpose of these substances is to create changes in consciousness. So when you take something such as MDMA, or we can even talk about other types of psychedelics such as psilocybin or LSD, you're going to see something. You're going to have clear changes in your consciousness. And those who have not taken these psychedelic substances most likely won't. Although, actually, in the case of the MDMA study, some people who did not take MDMA actually thought they took it. And this is also because of the environment in which they were situated in a room, and their eyes were, they had something over their eyes, they were laying down, so they were sort of in this meditative position. And of course, in such a situation, it's plausible that some people could actually have had some transformative experience. But it also, curiously, in the side of those who took MDMA, some people claimed that they were actually on the placebo group as well. This is just a very short amount of people that actually fell onto that side. But it's also curious. But so this idea that because the study wasn't blinded, it loses all of its efficacy, for me, I believe that this is a problematic claim. Because at the end of the day, we need to ask how much of expectancy plays an effect in the question at hand. And so an argument that some other researchers had was that in other areas of clinical research, it is known that the expectancy effect shouldn't have this much of an effect in terms of treatment, because the numbers that I told you previously about improvements in symptoms seemed far too much to just be a matter of expectancy effect. And so the robust effect of MDMA therapy, the way that it interacted with these PTSD symptoms, seems to be that it's too much to just be accounted in that situation. And so this is most certainly a very reasonable methodological concern to have. And this is something that is always being battled when it comes to psychedelic research studies. There's this attempt of trying to break the blind problem. And so you can have certain things that you can do to minimize this. You can have an active control condition. You can try to recruit individuals that had no psychedelic experiences before. You can also try to try to understand the expectations of the participants and the therapists, before treatment is implemented. So, because a lot of times when people go into a psychedelic research setting and they're going to take a psychedelic, they have very high expectations because they have this expectation that this is going to be completely life-changing. And for many people, it actually is life-changing, because we have also robust data claiming that for many people, when they take a psychedelic substance, the experience that they retrieve from it is considered to be one of the most important experiences that they have ever had in their lives. So this is not insignificant. And then, of course, another alternative is to have the person who's assessing the actual improvements in the mental health of these patients to be independent from the study. So it's someone who doesn't know whether these patients have actually, taken the placebo or the MDMA. So it's, other than the therapist, this is someone who's independently assessing the progress of these subjects. And so these are just some ways in which we can increase the internal validity and external validity of psychedelic studies. But once again, just this argument that since the study wasn't blind, that this is a big concern, well, it shouldn't be, especially given how robust the data is. And so I believe that overall, this can be seen as a setback in the progress that we have been making in recent years. Although, at the same time, I believe that we need to be very careful about what types of substances we are turning into our standards of treatment. I believe that in the case of DMA, of course, it's more about the physiological concerns regarding toxicity to different body systems. There was also actually another objection by the panel, which was regarding the therapy side of things. There were some claims that there was misconduct by therapists, because what happens when you take a substance like MDMA, and it's not only the case with MDMA, this also happens with SSRIs or serotonin modulating drugs, is that the person becomes more trustful of those around them. And so they become more trusting of the environment and the people around them. And this can be problematic, because if you have a therapist who has a very shady code of conduct, or is trying to take advantage of their patient, this is extremely problematic, because you have someone who has been made effectively more trustful. And so this is very advantageous for someone who wants to abuse some other person. And so this was one of the objections also by the panel, which was that there have been instances of sexual misconduct by therapists, and this can be extremely problematic. And then they were also discussing the scientific validity of the therapeutic model, which was put into play. And so all of that is an extremely important concern. I fully agree with that, because the therapy side of things is crucial to this, because in order to integrate your own experience, and this is true with any sort of psychedelic, and not even psychedelic, when we're discussing even conventional pharmacological tools such as SSRIs, we know from the data that a person will have better results if the person is mixing that psychopharmacological approach with actual therapy, because just taking the drugs isn't actually going to solve everything. And so you need the conjunction of both normally. And so in the cases of substances that have a greater power to change our ability to perceive the world, and in the case of MDMA, when I say perceive, I'm discussing more about in terms of the affective experience, because MDMA, and in my opinion and the opinion of many others, shouldn't really be considered a psychedelic drug, because there's an absence of this psychomimetic component of this, so you don't have changes in your visual experience. In some people you might have some different changes in the appreciation of colors and things like that, but it has nothing to do in terms of changing the way you perceive the world around you when you compare, for example, with LSD, DMT, or psilocybin. So it's not necessarily, I don't know if psychedelic would be the appropriate term for MDMA. But this therapeutic, the way that therapy is conducted in response to the experience is extremely important. Although this should have no bearing in terms of the FDA approval or not, because FDA does not regulate the psychological therapy. It's there to regulate the actual drug. So it should be, this conversation should be centered about the efficacy and the safety profile of the drug itself, of MDMA. And so I believe that this conversation about therapy and misconduct, that's something different. That's definitely a big problem, and we need to find ways to solve that. But the FDA doesn't regulate that. So I'm not sure actually why in this response to the denial of the committee, I'm not sure why this was the case. And so to conclude, overall, my opinion is that MDMA will eventually be approved. I believe that it is a substance that, unlike other traditional psychedelics such as psilocybin and LSD, it is more dangerous physiologically because there are the concerns about the cardiovascular and liver health are justified, although there are ways to mitigate that. Like I said, a lot of medications that people are taking that are approved, and we're talking about antipsychotics, we're talking about benzodiazepines, we're talking about SSRIs. They cause metabolic changes. They possess their own sometimes substantial health risks. We know this from literature, and it's becoming more and more apparent. This was something that wasn't being communicated and still isn't communicated a lot. If you tell people that by taking an SSRI, you might be increasing their risk of developing metabolic complications such as diabetes and metabolic syndrome, most people won't know about this because this isn't really communicated by doctors. And so, as we know, every drug, due to our imperfections, will always have some side effects, and they can be greater or smaller. And so, in my personal opinion, in the case of MDMA, I don't necessarily see it specially because, in my opinion, it needs to be applied in a therapeutic setting. I honestly don't see it being more dangerous than some of the drugs which are currently available in the market. And of course, this is a poor argument because you might argue, well, just because we're selling some crap in the market doesn't necessarily mean that we should allow new crap to get in. But I think the answer here is I believe that MDMA truly has potential from the studies that have been released. I think these physiological safety concerns are something that can be monitored. And so I don't believe that's problematic. And I also believe that we need to be more open-minded in research, in trying to understand different mechanisms of action and actually being open to different tools. Because when we're talking about psychiatry, we're still using tools that were developed 50 years ago. We're still focusing on the same mechanisms of action. Yes, the drugs that we have been developing have been getting fewer side effects, but we're so far away from where we need to be. There's just so much suffering that is going on, so many people that are not responding to treatment. And so I believe that psychedelics, and here I'm not just talking about MDMA, I'm talking about psilocybin, LSD, I truly believe that they can have a big impact in the way that we can manage these mental illnesses. And I also believe that we as humans, we have evolved with these substances historically. We have countless reports, and we still have active communities that have rituals around the use of psychedelics. And so it is used as actually a community binding resource. Now, that being said, I'm not saying that psychedelics are for everyone. And I also believe that psychedelics should only be taken in a therapeutic setting. I do not believe in the recreational use of psychedelics because I just think that there are certain risks which are inherent to psychedelics where you truly need to make sure that, for one, you're ready. You need to make sure that your setting is optimized. and you need to have a purpose for doing it. And so the risks that might come with psychedelics, and of course here I don't want to fearmonger, but there are some risks that for most psychedelics they're not related to risks to your physical health. They're more about generating these disruptive states of consciousness where the person then doesn't have the ability to integrate that knowledge. There's sort of this unearned wisdom which is gained, and this can be deeply destabilizing. People may suffer from depersonalization, derealization. Some people, this can trigger some psychotic spectrum disorders. And so it's very important to fully do a background check, psychiatric check before actually engaging with these substances. But that being said, I'm fully for the development, the study, and the use of these drugs in terms of being potential tools in addressing mental health concerns. So hopefully you found this video useful. I'm also hoping to discuss some other studies which were defunded or actually stopped. One of them, another study regarding the ketogenic diet in inpatient schizophrenic individuals, which was rejected, and a study on clozapine, an antipsychotic, was done instead of that, was favored instead of that. And so I believe that we're reaching a point where we clearly understand that we need to revolutionize psychiatry. We need to find new, better tools, but it's hard. It's hard to change the course of action. I think we have gotten too used to the things we think we know and use. I think there's also a problem where many of the people who are implementing and doing these treatments don't really have any personal experience of what it is to have a mental illness. And of course, I'm not saying that this is a prerequisite towards being a researcher or a psychiatrist in this field. It's not, of course. But it helps to have some sort of idea in terms of having actually experienced, taken these drugs, having suffered from these conditions, and actually knowing how much help, how much difference there needs to be in the way we are approaching it right now. And so, because we truly still are sort of in the dark ages. And so there's so much improvement that needs to be done. And hopefully in the next videos, I will also cover some other aspects that I have discussed in this one. So thank you, and hopefully you found this useful.